No, you're all right.
Welcome once again, everybody, to this morning's Economist breakfast with our 2020 Wellington Business Expo launch, sponsored by our platinum partner NZME, with our special guest Brad Olsen. For a few of you that don't know me, my name is Mark Skelly. I am President of the Hutt Valley Chamber of Commerce. Today's a very exciting day for us at the Chamber as we're launching New Zealand's very first online business expo. The Hutt Valley Chamber of Commerce usually holds a physical business expo each year, and that lasts one day. But due to the impact of COVID on events, we got a little creative this year and moved our expo for 2020 online and extended it to run for 2 entire weeks. I'd like to extend, I'll talk more about that later, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our event sponsors, NZME, and for those of you like me that thought it might have been NZME until lately, no, it's pronounced NZME. Just helping everybody in the room, guys. NZME are a platinum partner of the Chamber and have been huge supporters of this year's Expo. They've assisted us with advertising the Expo through multiple radio advertisements, banner ads, sponsored articles through the NZ Herald online, as well as through the NZ Herald Facebook page. So their marketing reach goes way beyond the traditional radio that you might naturally attribute to them. We'd like to thank you and your entire team. Many of you are here today for supporting our event. It is greatly, greatly appreciated. I'd also like to extend another warm welcome to our special guest, Brad Olsen. Today we've asked Brad to provide you with an update on the global economy as well as the local Wellington and specifically Lower Hutt economy. Before I hand over to Vanya from NZME, I'd like to mention the special guests we have here this morning. We have Lower Hutt Mayor Campbell Barry, welcome Campbell, and Upper Hutt Mayor Wayne Guppy. We also have Deputy Mayor of Upper Hutt, Helen Swales. We've got Ginny Anderson, our Labourist MP for Hutt South, Chris Bishop, our National MP for Hutt South, and we have Joe Miller, the CEO of the Hutt City Council. So welcome everybody. We also have several of our Chamber board members here today. We have Celia Birdling, Dave Morgan, our Vice President, and Tony McCone. We also have some platinum partners here, obviously NZME that I've mentioned before, as well as Link Business Brokers. We have our new gold partners, Equip Recruitment. Welcome everybody. Silver partners, McCone Consultancy, and bronze partner, Red Hot Business Coaching, which would be me. We've also got our team here, and lots of our team have been here today helping in the background. Obviously, Helen Down, our CEO, most of you have met. Hannah Doyle, our events coordinator, who made today happen, so well done, Hannah. Raywin Langford, our marketing and digital marketing coordinator, and Fiona Morley, who's our business community engagement and finance role. Now, last thing from me is some housekeeping, the really important piece. If you need to go to the toilet, they're through the doors. Yeah, you go and take. No, they're through the doors and they're on the stairwell. The evacuation process, if there is an emergency, please go out the main doors and go to the Dowser Square, which is the open space across the road. We will get wet. I'm now going to hand over to Vanya Pine from NZME, and she's going to introduce Brad Olsen. Thanks, Vanya.
Good morning. As you know, I'm Vanya Pine and I'm the General Manager for the Greater Wellington region for NZME, New Zealand Media and Entertainment. We're thrilled to be here today and to be a Platinum Partner for the Wellington Business Expo and with Hutt Valley Chamber of Commerce. At NZME, we're really committed to working with businesses in our region to connect our audiences with your customers. We reach 3.2 million New Zealanders every day through the Herald, our community paper network, NZ Herald Online, Grab One, One Roof, iHeart, it's a long list, and our heritage radio stations, News Talk ZB, ZM, The Hits, Hauraki, Coast, and our newest station, Gold. We're able to assist with overall strategy across all of those platforms and also creative, whether it be audio or digital or activations. But I'm not here today to sell you NZME. I'm here to introduce our guest speaker, Brad Olsen. Brad is a regular contributor on News Talk ZB's Top Rating Drive show with Heather Duplessis-Allen. Brad is a senior economist at Infometrics and a leading economic commentator across New Zealand. At present, he is focused on the economic effects of COVID-19, which I'm sure he'll touch on this morning. Since joining Infometrics in 2015, Brad has risen to be one of New Zealand's more prominent and youngest economic commentators. regularly featuring across TV, radio, print and online. Brad's role at Infometrics covers all parts of the business. In the regional and sector space, he is responsible for interacting with clients and providing key regional and industry level economic insights. He is also part of the forecasting team, analysing the latest trends and looking at how the economy is shifting. He has completed a range of bespoke consulting projects, including public policy costings in the education and healthcare space. Brad's role includes regularly making presentations across the country to examine current and emerging trends. Brad's an active and engaged member of the local community and is currently New Zealand's youngest Justice of the Peace. He is also a member of the Global Shapers Community, Wellington Hutt, Wellington City Youth Council, the Citizens Health Council, the Asian New Zealand Foundation Leadership Network, the Wellington District Licensing Committee, and volunteers with Take 10. In 2016, he was announced as New Zealand's Queen's Young Leader and has met with the Queen on 3 occasions. Impressive. So with all that being said, it is my pleasure to welcome Brad Olsen.
Kia ora everyone, thank you so much. All of those, that last list at the end is more because I never really learned how to make too many friends and thought I'd better spend the time somewhere else. Kia ora everyone, thank you so much for having me here. I wish it was under better circumstances that I could return to the Hutt and discuss what's happening, but we do need to be realistic that New Zealand remains in the grip of a global pandemic and of a recession that is hitting both our country and everywhere else. This is the greatest economic hit in a century. It is not quite as bad yet as the Great Depression, and that is because we have made some significant changes to how we approached previous crises. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves and think we've beaten this yet, because there is still a lot of water to go under the bridge. I've been allocated 30 minutes and I will have to try and keep as closely to that as possible with as much content as I can try to get through. But as you'll see with the title of my presentation, A Still Uncertain Path Ahead, there's only so much crystal ball gazing that any economist can try and provide. Now from my point of view, I could come to the Hutt and tell you how things are going, or I could do the smart thing and let you guys tell me how it's actually going. So I'm going to focus a bit more on what we're seeing throughout the national economy and what's happening globally, and how some of the big emerging trends due to COVID-19 are starting to affect that national economy and what that might do to the Hutt. We'll do some questions at the end, so hold those. If you do put up a hand, I will probably ignore it for the minute. So, to start with, and this just reiterates that we are not over this yet. The number of COVID-19 cases around the globe is not slowing down, it's getting faster. So, you know, we had a first wave of cases come through, particularly moving from China into Europe, then into the US. It's now even further afield, and we're seeing renewed resurgence in cases, not only in Europe and the UK, but again in the likes of India and elsewhere. The rise in those cases is concerning because it says that although New Zealand may well have gotten rid of COVID-19 not once, twice, but 3 times, we are a lifeboat floating amongst a sea of pandemic, and New Zealand can only operate like that for so long. The global economy will hit us. We cannot avoid that. The hit to the economy has been huge, and I say that because at the moment there is a feeling that the economy is going a lot better. Now that is certainly true, but that's because our reference point is in the middle of April when we were locked at home for 4.5 weeks. The hit that you can see to New Zealand's economic activity was absolutely phenomenal. The difference being that you probably can't even see the GFC on that little graph that I've put up there, such as the size of the immediate hit. And again, just reiterating that the severe shock that we have encountered is something that is unlike anything in living memory or elsewhere recorded in history. That hit is coming through broadly in 3 ways. The first is that we've got a very strong agri-sector and primary sector that is helping us through. New Zealand and the world needs to eat, and we're able to provide that food. Over in China, you've heard from lawmakers and doctors who have told every Chinese citizen to drink at least 300 mils of milk a day. That's doing well for our exports. People are trying to keep themselves healthy across the world. That has done well for the likes of some of our vitamin C rich exports with kiwi fruit. Other of our exports like logs and forestry to China, not doing quite so well because I don't know if you've ever tried to gnaw into a bit of wood, but it's not quite so tasty. Construction providing a bit more of a mixed bag at the moment. We're still seeing activity holding up a lot better than expected, but if you're a business out there, you're not quite so keen to expand on the whole because those economic conditions remain very uncertain. We have seen again that those construction numbers have held up, but at the same time there is always risks with construction. We saw that during the GFC when it absolutely dropped its guts, to be honest. We've got infrastructure which is providing a bit more support when it eventually gets out the door. Anytime you hear shovel-ready project, and I was one of the people that helped coin that term in this country, shovel-ready projects are normally shovel-ready plus 9 months. So they don't get going quite so quickly, and that's just the nature of the beast. Dad's a chippy and I've never seen him run to a work site that fast. So these things take time. Tourism is of course the area that we're all familiar with. Well, we were familiar with it at least. That has changed. We obviously don't have tourists coming in over the border, but instead we've got domestic tourism that is helping to prop up the country as much as we can. It's interesting to see that New Zealanders have done incredibly well with renewing the Great New Zealand Roadie, heading off to discover the wonderful sights of Aotearoa, somehow discovering that instead of going overseas you can actually have a pretty good go of your backyard first. That is certainly strong. There are also some very key regional factors that will play into this. The likes of Tiwai Point in Southland is going to hurt. Marsden Point up in Whangarei contributes 12% of the economy and is shedding jobs. You've also got the likes of Methanex in Taranaki and the Glenbrook Steel Mill in northern Waikato. And at the local area here, there's a lot of manufacturing activity that goes on. Now, although that for a lot of you may well be going all right at the minute, it was still tough a few months back, and that path ahead remains, funnily enough, uncertain still. And so those regional implications will be important. You can see that with Infometrics' estimate of how economic activity has hit across New Zealand. It is not being felt evenly. You can see that the hardest hit being those areas that often have a bit more exposure to tourism. Now, what's important to look at here is it's not if you have tourism, you're stuffed, and if you don't have tourism, you're good. It's more how all of those different industry level implications bear out. If you look at towards the bottom, the second from bottom hit area was Gisborne, Tairāwhiti. Now, not only does it not have a huge amount of international tourism, it's got a very strong primary base. Some of the regions in the middle of the pack also have a strong primary base, but at the same time have a strong tourism activity. So we're trying to weigh up all of these competing elements all at the same time. Manawatu Whanganui, for example, performing particularly well again with a very strong, healthy primary sector. Wellington region, relatively in the middle of the pack there. We've seen some parts, particularly the Waipa, who have performed particularly well. Wellington City, not so much. The Hutt keeping up there as much as possible given these incredibly uncertain times. But let's get into what we're expecting with our forecast and what the pathway is into the future. And the unfortunate news is this is not a quick hit to the economy either. The effects of COVID-19, of the slowdown, of the global hit, the domestic hit and the industry hit is going to be felt for a long time. Now, it's not going to come on as fast as a lot of people originally feared. You can see the green line there was the government's expectation of unemployment during lockdown. That was a little bit premature. We had the wage subsidy that has kept people in work, but the feeling now is that although unemployment will gradually rise, it will also only gradually fall because the amount of economic scarring, now that's an economic term where basically we've got some industries that are not going to come back to the same level. Tourism does not bounce back the minute we open the borders again, and that's a good 5% of the economy all in of itself. So although we are not going to see the hit coming on straight away and then an immediate recovery, we're also not going to see that the hit is quite as strong either. So the profile for this is that it will be with us for a while. In terms of economic activity, Infometrics currently expects that it takes until 2023 before New Zealand's economic activity rebounds to pre-pandemic levels. That is a sizable time frame, and I look round at you all with sort of a bit of a shocked look on your face, like, jeepers, that's going to be a hard knock. And it is, But at the same time, the resilience that the economy has shown so far means that the pathway forward is generally only up, because we have had some of those hardest hits and we're all working in a coordinated fashion to move forward. Tourism, like I said, is definitely not going to bounce back the same way, and I had a conversation with some people down the front earlier about that. It's not just that the borders are closed. Even if we were to throw them open tomorrow, it's important to remember that the likes of the rest of the globe is still in recession. Those people don't have as much money. China, for example, one of our really important tourism partners, they locked down far before anyone else in the world in January. Their spending in July hadn't returned to pre-pandemic levels 7 months on. New Zealand's took 2.5 to bounce above 2019 levels. So the hit is coming across the world, and it means that even if we were able to have tourists coming in, they don't have as much cash. New Zealand's a hard place and an expensive place to get to sometimes, so we're limited in that fact. Just as importantly, and this is a key facet of this pandemic, of this crisis, that we haven't seen since the 1970s, is that the economic hit from this pandemic is both a supply and a demand side shock. We don't often have supply side issues. At the moment, we've lost a lot of the potential for people to come to New Zealand, to come to our country, if we were to open borders, is still somewhat limited. It's still not over yet. However, one of the big drivers of New Zealand's economic activity over the last 10 years has substantially changed. Normally, over the last 10 years, we've seen thousands of people pour over the border, both to fill some of the skills gaps that New Zealand has had, but also because they see New Zealand as a fantastic place to live, and they're absolutely right. However, it's important to note that after a massive surge of returning Kiwis and others at the start of the year, the actual number of people coming into the country at the moment is very much less than a trickle. We had 33,000 people come over our borders as migrants for the first 3 months of the year. That's 33,000. We then had 800 come in for the next 3 months. The differences are huge there, and because New Zealand on a per capita basis hasn't really been growing all that fast in previous times, there is a risk that New Zealand does start to stagnate in the economic fronts once we start to move through this pandemic and get onto that path for recovery. It's also clear that there will be skills gaps that emerge across the country and skills shortages for a number of businesses. One of the key areas that we need our politicians to provide us with is a clear understanding of what's going to happen around that area, who's allowed in and who's not. Is it only Avatar workers and Emirates Team New Zealand, or do we have to have a more comprehensive approach? And I say that a little bit facetiously, but I think it's important we do lock that down very clearly, because otherwise people in this room and others across the country will be struggling for workers until such time as we get Kiwis ready to work again. The wage subsidy has protected jobs, and I do want to highlight that because when we first saw the pandemic hit, we expected the wage subsidy would only delay the inevitable. We're glad to be wrong on that front, and we have seen job losses so far that haven't come through quite as strongly. You do, though, have a number of industries that are still in a very hard-hit place. Construction, for example, 101% coverage by the wage subsidy according to official numbers. I'd like to think that's because there's a couple of subbies in that who might be not quite as keen on the IRD's books, but we'll get there eventually, I'm sure. What it does profile, though, is that the hit from this has been huge. Now, the orange bars, put them aside for a minute, because as many people as possible got that wage subsidy during lockdown because the country was isolated and on lock and key. The blue bars are a little bit more interesting, that you see with the extension coming through a lot stronger for those tourism-related businesses. The importance there highlighted by trying to keep people as much as possible ready to go. However, moving forward, we cannot rely on the wage subsidy to make us park up until all of this rolls over, because it's not going to happen quickly. We have to pivot in the future to have a much greater focus on resilience of business and operating at different alert levels and in different ways. Because simply saying to a builder that you've got to go and sit on your chuff for 4.5 weeks isn't going to cut it if we have further lockdowns and further restrictions. We have to start working a little bit smarter, because as much as this has protected employment, going forward it's going to cost us a huge amount if we do continue to work with it, and we've got to make sure we actually use that for the recovery, not just tiding us over until the worst passes. We've also seen that that has started to come off. So like I highlighted, we saw a number of people that have been supported throughout. The wage subsidy is all but gone at this point, and so businesses are standing on their own 2 feet. What we are also hearing and seeing from businesses is that they made a lot of any cuts that they needed to very immediately. They wanted to make sure that they had the right-sized business when they emerged from lockdown, and so we haven't seen job losses rise quite as substantially. What we have seen instead is that a number of businesses are cutting the hours that their workers are doing. So unlike previous crises like the GFC, when businesses cut a huge bunch of workers and 6 months later tried to rehire them only to find they'd gone overseas or gone to another firm, they're trying to keep people on, keep them connected to the workforce, but we are seeing that people don't have as much money in their back pockets. What's quite clear looking through some of the numbers is that although in the month of August we read per worker were down 0.5%, reiterating that people don't have as much spare cash, they are going to be a bit more resistant heading into the next year about where they are putting their money. The number of people on government support is high. We continue to see those numbers rise gradually, but what we've also seen is that the number of people on the CIRP, the COVID Income Relief Payment, paying you about double the benefit, is starting to come off. We're not seeing those people come back onto job seeker support. Now, because we haven't seen those people necessarily get into jobs either, there's a number of groups who are going from having $4.90 cash in hand a week to not $4.90, and that will have an impact on how much spending happens across the economy. So far, we have 70,000 odd Kiwis who are on government support since the lockdown happened. During the GFC, it took us 21 months to add that sort of number. We did it in 4 this time, and we haven't stopped yet. Those job numbers are fascinating to highlight, and this is where I'll get a little bit more focused in discussing what we're seeing in the Hutt as well. We can see that some of the usual culprits that you'd expect, the likes of parts of the media and similar, has taken a hard blow, and I think we have to acknowledge that. Tourism-related businesses are also in a hard place. And so we have seen some of those job losses coming through. You can see that at the top of the screen. What you can also see though down the bottom is that the government's hiring. So if you know anyone who needs a job, send them over to the city because there seems to be roles galore. Now look, that is what happens in a crisis. The public service and public sector has to step up because the private sector is unwilling. But it is worthwhile noting that that generally benefits the Wellington region a little bit more. So there is obvious potential for us to keep going and weather this storm in a slightly better front. You can also see that construction's holding up all right. That's good. We're seeing some of those shovel-ready projects at least keep people in work and seeing more people go into apprenticeships so we have the skills to work it. Funnily enough, for a health crisis, healthcare and social assistance is holding up not too bad. Again, the additional capacity needed there will remain quite important, and the primary sector remains rocking along. What is surprising, and I've highlighted it there in that blue bar, is the 1.5% growth in manufacturing jobs. And I say that because of how important manufacturing is to the Hutt. Now, we were expecting at the start of this crisis that manufacturing would take a hard hit. And a lot of that was due to that global demand not coming through. In a recession, no one's quite as keen to buy as many New Zealand-made goods. They just don't have the money. However, the supply disruptions across the rest of the world means that New Zealand is a very good option to make sure that we are still manufacturing goods for overseas. But more importantly, where Kiwi businesses can't get product from across the world, they're turning increasingly to New Zealand businesses and New Zealand manufacturers to fill those gaps. And those businesses are stepping up to the plate and adding workers to fill that capacity. The spending trends that we're seeing emerge are quite considerable, and this is where we definitely get to the what's changing because of COVID, or certainly what are we seeing in the interim. Basically what happened is that everyone during lockdown had to learn how to cook. Now, I'm not saying I'd invite any of you over for breakfast, lunch or dinner because you'd get something that was probably half pie burned, but I had to learn how to cook a little bit during those 4.5 weeks of lockdown. Now, that coupled with people who are feeling just a bit more of a pinch on their budgets and their wallets is meaning that that grocery spending is holding up. It doesn't look like we're fully hoarding toilet paper anymore, but we are buying more food at the supermarket. Now, that's good if you're a home cooker. Not so great if you're in the hospitality business. We haven't seen that spending starting to move through quite as fast. It has certainly recovered and that is advantageous to that sector, but there are still a number of struggles underway because the trend when people have less money is that those sort of discretionary spends, going out for a cuppa, going out for dinner, going out for lunch, they do get cut more immediately. We've also seen though that Kiwis sat down for 4.5 weeks and thought, geez, this couch isn't much fun. I really need a new one. So we've seen a lot of spending going out into the home and recreation space, furniture and similar, but also a lot of people sat there with their significant other and said, hey, you know that deck you've been meaning to build for a few years? Maybe it's time to get that done. We've seen a number of home renovations starting to come through, and there's a lot of money going into that sector. Essentially, post-lockdown, you had Kiwis who, one, had a bunch of money that they'd saved up from lockdown, and two, couldn't go overseas. That money went into three broad areas. The first was domestic tourism, great to get around the country, do the Great New Zealand Roadie. Second was cars. People thought, well, if I'm not going to go overseas, I'll park a bit of cash into a new car. That's the second biggest investment that a household normally makes, and so that's strong from an economic perspective. But you also saw those home renovations coming through quite strongly, which I think is everyone going, well, if the housing market does actually hold up, then I'll get a bit more for my property, and if it doesn't, well, I'll have that new deck, which will please the family. So we have seen that spending coming through. And you can see that in those numbers. You can also see that accommodation, for example, starting to trend back up, which gives us that renewed confidence that things are getting better, although I hasten to caution that we are not back to normal yet. What is fascinating and has huge relevance for this area is that working from home is actually a thing. If you asked me a few months back during lockdown how quickly working from home would happen, I would have thought it would have taken a bit longer. What we've seen though is that it's not just the employees who like working at home, it's their bosses. And if any good business knows, if you get the boss on board, you get a lot more things moving. And so we have seen that quite considerable shift. Now I've given you a few examples here. If you look at the orange line rather with Wellington City, you can notice that in Wellington City, spending has only just once or twice made it above 2019 levels. Spending in the blue line though for Lower Hutt, considerably above, generally sitting at around about 10%. Now that is highlighting that people are spending in a different place because they are working at home a bit more. What you don't see on that graph, because I've only got so much time and so many slides, is that if you look at total spending across the Wellington region, total spending is actually still down. So although people are spending in a different place, they are still spending less money. The key analogy being that if I was going to spend $20 on lunch at work in Wellington, I may well only go out for a $4.50 coffee and make myself a sandwich if I'm working at home. So that spending has shifted, but it has also come back. That does raise concerns for what we do in the future, but it also means that where people are operating is considerably different. I've also given you Hamilton and Waipa, so Waipa being Cambridge, if you will, highlighting again that we have seen that people are moving slightly out of those more metro areas, keener to work in some of the more provincial spots. Those trends of remote working and working from home are going to be considerable, particularly for places like the Hutt and increasingly Waipa too. People are looking for a place that is a bit more affordable, a fantastic place to raise the kids, has some of those lifestyle options that isn't a hustle-bustle metro area. That is going to provide opportunities for areas into the future, but areas are going to have to capitalise on it and work hard to attract the right people, because across New Zealand, everyone's seeing this trend and everyone's trying to get in on the business. I highlighted before that we continue to see the number of people, the number of goods that we're actually bringing into the country is limited by some of those supply shocks. You don't actually have to care too much about this graph other than to show that see everything's below the zero line basically means we're not bringing a huge amount of stuff into the country. That highlights two things. One, that there are those supply issues from overseas, so sometimes when we want to bring stuff in, we can't. And so we're having to make up that difference here in New Zealand. And again, some of our manufacturers are stepping up to the plate very clearly there. At the same time, it also shows some early signs that consumers aren't wanting to buy as much stuff, and so they don't need to import quite as much coming over the border either. So we're seeing that those imports are still in a pretty soft position, and that is likely to continue. There's always that risk as well, talking to some suppliers and retailers around the place, that you might want to get in for your Christmas shopping just a little bit earlier than normal, because if you're looking for that one special toy for the kids, it may well be sold out if you leave it till the night before Christmas. On the export front though, New Zealand is going considerably better. Again, that primary sector activity is booming, the world has to eat and we're able to provide it. What is interesting though is that New Zealand has to keep adapting how we operate in the global market. For example, you'll see that our meat numbers in the blue there, in the orange rather, are relatively low for the since February number. Only up something like 0.4%, I think it might be. What we are seeing there with the likes of meat is a pivot in how we sell. Normally New Zealand puts meat out into the world to go into restaurants with slightly more premium cuts. Now, given that 50% of restaurant bookings aren't happening across the world at the moment, we'd be on a hiding to nothing if we made no change. So New Zealand now is opting for how do we get our product into supermarkets and back into people's homes. Similar sort of things happening with wine, where we're seeing that people aren't going to buy a mid to high range bottle because they're not that keen to down that, while they're at home. But if they can get a low to mid-range bottle of New Zealand wine at the supermarket and have that with maybe a nice piece of New Zealand lamb at home as well, that's a better option. But it is meaning that we're having to change our product offering and highlights that we can't continue to sit still while the globe around us changes. I highlighted in the likes of fruit, we've had a bumpy year and you've seen those numbers coming through quite strongly. Again, kiwi fruit, a real winner for us there, and our dairy exports holding up as well. What's interesting is that the total trade position still remains just a touch precarious though. In the orange you'll see our total goods trade, which is sitting ever so slightly up on last year, ever so slightly up. And that does profile that although our primary sector is doing well, other parts of the economy and the export sector are not necessarily going as great guns as we might have expected. You'll see for the likes of non-food manufactured goods in the blue that they have started to come up in the last few months, a little bit flat in September, but have come up after a pretty hard few months after lockdown. But again, that profile remains 3.5% down for the first 6 months of the year. And that again reiterates that we're not finished yet. Our expectations for global growth continue to deteriorate, given what I showed you in that first graph of those numbers just going higher and higher in terms of COVID-19 cases. The risk of further lockdowns and similar restrictions across the globe remain quite high. The UK, for example, going back into lockdown for a considerable period. Who knows what's going on in the States? They don't even understand it at the moment. And we are seeing those resurgences again throughout Europe and parts of Asia as well. The profile for New Zealand is that we are in a better position. We are making as good of a fist as we can of a global pandemic and a global slowdown. But if eventually that global hit will come and hit us, eventually those supply chains across the world will reinvent themselves, but really we need to make hay while the sun shines. For the Hutt, there are considerable challenges of how we get businesses moving. We've been looking at some of the business confidence numbers which highlight that businesses are feeling more upbeat than in previous times, but they also see a tough path ahead. For a number of businesses, it's not because they think the economy is necessarily going to go worse, it's just that no one knows. And I say that as an economist with apparently a better crystal ball than everyone else, that the outlook is still very uncertain. We're not sure where things are going yet. But what we do know is that having a plan means that we can react better. By having a plan, we make sure that when certain milestones occur, we're ready to react. We know what we have to do and how quickly we have to move on things, rather than being reactionary and kicking out the chair legs as we try and stand up. So with that, we are facing uncertain times. We will continue to face them for a while. Keep your wits about you, keep safe, and we will get through this. Happy now to try and take any questions. Don't all talk at once. No, seriously, don't all talk. Sir. Oh.
Just curious as to, on the assumption that Labour won the election, what do you think is likely to change in their policies from what we're doing today?
Yep, I have to keep a little bit careful here because Infometrics, for disclosure, has been doing the Labour fiscal audit, but I think speaking outside of that and not about anything that isn't public, well, I expect we will see a continuation of the same. The focus, though, I think is going to shift in the next term of government much more to the recovery than the response. And I sort of highlighted that with the likes of the wage subsidy, that is a policy that was fit for the immediate purpose, but going forward we have to find a new way to operate. We've seen a lot of money that's gone into some of the training elements, and I expect that will continue and ramp up further. The focus also needs to be making sure that we target the right people. We know throughout this pandemic that the likes of Māori, women and young people have been hit hardest by the pandemic, by the job losses. But at the same time, I was talking up in Whangarei the other day that if a young person wants to go into a trades training course, that's free, but if they want to become a nurse, they're paying $7,000 a year. And so we need to make sure that we are having a slightly broader discussion about what those skills gaps are, because talking to every DHB I've ever talked to, there's not enough nurses and there's still not enough teachers. So we have to fill some of those skills gaps. So that education focus, I think, needs to be a little bit wider and more holistic so that we can identify those skills. But I do expect the direction of travel will remain relatively similar, from the sole position that if you make too many changes, you're going to scare businesses off making investment, and I think the government will be keen to maintain a stable platform to allow for that investment to eventually come through.
Brett, what about you talked about the net migration dropping, but what about the impact of all the Kiwis that return? How's that reflect?
They were a little bit of a one-off, and I know that Westpac put out some commentary recently that sort of put a little bit of salt into the conversation there over just how much of an impact that has actually been and how many people we've seen come back in. Migration's a bit of a quirk of supply as well at the moment, in the sense that one of the reasons migration is so high is because even if you wanted to, you can't really leave the country. We've seen the number of people on visas that have been extended rise quite considerably, and that sort of just pushed people out. So instead of being sort of a short-term worker, they're now here for a year or two. The challenge, I think, moving forward is that it is providing a little bit of additional heat to the housing market, but I think there's probably wider issues there in terms of what we've got from interest rates. The broader question that I don't have an answer to, but we need to grapple with, is what sort of skills and what sort of workers are these returning Kiwis? Are they people that we're able to use as brain gainers, that we can bring them in and without displacing other workers, we can get them doing some productive work and get them bringing some money into New Zealand? Or are they people that are looking for new jobs? Initial indications seem to suggest they are a mix of both. They're not just people coming into New Zealand with no job and no future, but equally there are still quite a few who are finding it tough to find a job, and so they have gone on to government support. Moving forward, I think we're not likely to see quite as many come in. The question, I think, is that when the borders do start to reopen, how many people head off again? Or how many people stick around and say, actually, New Zealand's been a pretty good place, I'll stay here for a bit longer. So that one is a very uncertain picture, and we don't have very good information about who we've got coming into the country, what they're doing and what they're likely to do. And okay, so the question, just so everyone heard it, was do we think that businesses actually think that this is going to be a longer hit, and if so, have they prepared, or if not, have they prepared for that, what that will look like? No, I don't think we have, and I think that was pretty well proven by the second resurgence in Auckland. We got rid of COVID and we all jumped around and thought we got rid of it. We were complacent as anything, and that's no blame, that's just, how it felt. Now, I'm a little bit worried that we're getting to that position again. I know that mandatory mask wearing is no longer a thing, but given that I've been across the country at a few different places over the last 2 weeks, everyone seems to ignore the QR code detector, and it seems like if you can get as much up in someone's grill as possible, you probably should. So I do think we're becoming a little bit complacent as a country. More broadly though, I don't think that we have fully got businesses on board with that thinking. That's part of why I give the presentation the way I do. It's not to alarm and tell you that the outlook is doom and gloom. It's trying to be realistic that this hit is not going to be quite so immediate as people might think. Moving ahead for businesses, I think what we need to see is that if the potential for the likes of a further lockdown or at least further restrictions of some kind come in, can businesses actually operate at that? I think we keep talking about the new normal, and I've talked about that quite a lot in the last few months. The new normal is not post-pandemic New Zealand, it's currently in pandemic New Zealand, and basically from a business point of view, you should be trying to work or make sure that you can work like it's level 2. Because if you have to stop all of your business and operations because it's level 2, there is a heightened risk that you might be yo-yoing up and down those alert levels a bit more. So there is a need to do a bit more work on that front, but I think as a country we also need to keep our wits about us, because we've seen already that this thing can sneak up on us. And you saw how long it took us to get rid of it this time as well. I think there is that risk of complacency, so if you haven't got a QR code, which is legal by the way, please get one.
Hi Brett, thank you. You know, depending on what happens with the government and that sort of stuff, the coming elections, both parties have sort of talked about reforming the RMA, reforming the Three Waters reform, and at the same time, up and down the country, all councils are pretty much constrained their spending in this current financial year to deal with the COVID crisis and covering funding to be set aside. But going forward, and all councils involved, I work for Hutt City Council, we're all in the process of doing our long-term plans presently. There is an infrastructure bow wave in terms of asset renewal and all those sorts of things that we're all being confronted with, which is likely to see an uptick in rates given where they have been set for this year. But there is that balancing act. So what's your thoughts on all of that?
Yep, I might have to have coffee with you later because it might take a little bit longer than a quick answer, but I'll see what I can fit in shortly. What I think we are going to grapple with is not only that bow wave of infrastructure coming through and the possible cost issues, but also to a point the possible capacity issues we're likely to hit in the construction sector. And I think from a council point of view, there's going to be a great game of Tetris that goes on with infrastructure planning, so that you don't put your project in at the same time as a shovel-ready project or something similar that a private developer is doing, but also that need to make sure that once those workers have finished on that site, that they can immediately go into a new one. I think there's also a focus around some of the anchor projects that we likely need across the Wellington region that will enable private investment to start to run around alongside it. Moving forward, I think given that we see the house prices moving so hot and apparently people have substantial amounts of cash that they can use on housing, it doesn't seem like actually that many people have issues with possible rates rises. You sort of can't have it both ways. You can't have a hot housing market but say you can't afford other bits and pieces, because the challenge on the housing market, sorry to diverge for a second, is that we're seeing the immediate effect of housing coming through more in renting, because more of the workers who are likely to be out of work are renters before they're homeowners, but we will eventually see that come through into the housing market. I guess the position that we need to have moving forward is that if there is a huge amount of cash that the government is keen to spend on investing in local communities and to get some of our bigger and wider issues moving forward, then they may well have to stump up to the party with a bit more cash. Any local government politician in this room or council staffer will know that councils get a lot of roles from central government but often don't get the cash flow that's associated with it. And I think that's something that has been acknowledged by successive governments, but we haven't seen a step change yet in terms of how that funding moves. That will be an area we have to look at. I think as well it's probably important to remember that debt, when it comes to CapEx, is not a dirty word, it's just how you spread the cost. I'm a 23-year-old, I shouldn't have to pay for a bridge that people not even born yet are going to use in 50 years' time, so we spread that with debt and you pay those interest costs. We've got to be smart with that debt though and have, like I say, that good Tetris game going on. So we need more of it. We've got to be, I think, recognise that people are going to hit some cost pressures when it comes to paying their rates and similar, but at the same time, if we don't address these issues soon, they're not going away, they just get more expensive. Got away easy this time, so.
One last one.
Brad, can you just make a comment on what everybody is just watching, this housing market and commercial property, what you're seeing with commercial property in CBDs?
Yes, on the housing front more broadly, what you've got at the moment is a lot of upside risks. Basically, that's the low interest rates that are coming through. Now, to be clear, the Reserve Bank actually, under its agreement with the government, doesn't have to care about asset prices. It says, well, it's not that it's not our problem, it's that we are sort of blind to it. We are seeing, of course, that a lot of money is going into housing at the moment, but essentially that's because of those low interest rates, but more importantly, because there's no real downside risk. There's a big concrete floor under housing at the moment because of the mortgage deferral scheme and similar. At the moment, there's around about 10,000 mortgages across the country that are in, I think, at least a month's arrears, but they're not really classed as an issue yet. Once we get through to March next year, once those job losses continue to gradually rise, I would expect that the housing market does come off the boil slightly, but at the same time with those ultra low interest rates, with them heading lower and them staying lower, but more importantly with nowhere else to put your money, because it's not worth having a term deposit at the moment, people are looking for a good investment, and safe as houses is quite a literal term at the moment, so I think we'll continue to see that. On the commercial front, it's a real mixed bag in some senses. For some places, again, particularly some of those metro centres, you have started to see some areas that have there's a bit more vacancy going on. Office spaces are probably not going to see the immediate dive you might expect because of the likes of working from home, but that's only because you've got a fixed term tenancy maybe for a few more years. But I would expect that in the future you may well have a bit more of a spare base plate coming through for office and commercial space. Retail is struggling, generally speaking, but also that's been a shift that's been happening anyway. That move to online stores has been coming through. COVID-19 has really just pushed the accelerator on that. So I think we are going to have some issues coming through in the commercial space. More importantly at the moment, that there are still some tenants who are in a pretty tough position, and there's not as much movement on rents and similar. And so I think for a lot more over Christmas there might well be some soul searching, some number crunching, and a bit more of a fraught 2021 there. Brilliant. Thank you so much for hearing from me.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you to NZME for sponsoring Brad being here today. And thanks, Peter, for your question. Peter does this work for the Hutt City Council. He's the CEO up there, and I omitted to welcome him earlier, so welcome, Peter. Clearly, the message for the entire Hutt Valley is uncertainty. Just summed up your entire speech. Thank you, Brad. That's really, really interesting. The stats and the figures and what goes behind what you were saying, I found really, really fascinating, Brad, so thank you very much. As mentioned earlier, the Hutt Valley Chamber of Commerce made the decision to move our Business Expo 2020